Citizens of Havelock, thanks for watching this video. I want to take a second or two and just kind of let you know what you're about to watch and why we've got this video up on our website for you to check out. So this video is actual footage from a workshop that we just recently had where a third party, which was the UNC School of Government Environmental Finance Group, came in, took our data, looked at the health of our water and sewer systems and our finances associated with those, and then put together a bunch of data points for us so that the board can start using that data to look at the future and review our system and maybe what the future path might be for rate structure, deferred maintenance, things like that. So what we decided before that meeting started was, man, this is going to be really good information for our citizens, especially those of you who have been obviously very interested in your utility bill. And this is two components of that, both the water and the sewer. So we recorded the actual meeting. So what you're about to see is this group from the UNC School of Government giving us their objective information on the data that we provided them. And so you'll see things in there like quick ratios and cash on hand and depreciation versus income and things like that. And that data was meant to give the Board of Commissioners as clear a picture as possible on what the current rate structure will do based on the future health of our system and how we'll stay at the ratios that we really need to stay at for both the health of the system and to stay within the parameters of the local government commission and the state of North Carolina for our financial health for those enterprise systems. It's a lot of information, and I understand that. After you watch this video, if you've got more questions, we'd love to answer them. Feel free to contact us through our email on the website, call us up at City Hall, set a meeting up to sit down with me. We'd be happy to go over the information with you. Also, there'll be a lot more to follow on this over the next year, so please join us at future workshops or board meetings where we're talking about water and sewer rates and trying to figure out what that looks like for the future and how we're taking care of our system. Enjoy your video, and thank you for taking the time to learn a little bit more about your city.
Appreciate it. So I'm going to speak tonight about utility needs in general. I don't think what I share is going to shock too many of us here tonight. I think it's a good summary before we get the other folks up to talk about funding and whatnot. So a couple of key topics that I'm going to hit on is your treatment capacity at your wastewater and your water plant, a little bit about what that picture looks like, and maybe when you need to be thinking about something there. I'm going to hit on the criticality of being sure that the facilities that we do have continue to run at their intended service level. I'm going to talk a little bit about prioritizing the wastewater collection needs. That'll be a little bit of a couple of refresher slides from earlier this year, but I think an important message to remind us of here. I will hit briefly on water distribution considerations because, quite frankly, other than extensions, that's not too meaty of a topic. And then I'll talk a little bit about extensions and water and wastewater system expansions. All right, let's start with the plant stuff. I am not going to read this to you. The only thing you need to conclude from this is that the administrative code in our state provides some guidance on when you need to expand your wastewater plant based on flows, okay? And so that's what this says. You can go back and read the gory details, and I'm going to summarize it here and even better in a graph in just a second. So your current wastewater plant capacity is 2.25 MGD, and so that is on the average on any month. You're not supposed to exceed that. What the state says is that if your annual average gets to be 80% of that, which is 1.8 MGD, then they can halt growth until you get a plan underway. They go on to say that if your annual average gets to be 90% of your permitted capacity, they can halt growth until you get construction permits and whatnot done. And so that's the meat and the requirements that the state has in place, so we know when we have to be investing in expanded wastewater capacity. So this graph is a graph of your wastewater flow and a few more things for the last 10 years. This goes through calendar year 23. And what you see in the dark line there is that's the annual average wastewater flow going to your wastewater plant, okay? The top orange line is what your plant is permitted to treat. And then you got your 90% line and your 80% line, which we just talked about. The points on this greenish line, light blue, whatever this is, those are your max month flows. And so basically, if you were to have one of those peaks go up and exceed or approach 2.25 MGD, then you're at your permit capacity for that month. And so what we see from this graph, and we don't need to get too lost in all the lines here, is that so far we've been operating well under the 80% mark for your annual averages. We had a couple of events or years a few years ago that approached it, and certainly below 90%. The other thing that I would point out here is that for the last couple of years, your flows have been relatively low. And one of the things that we're watching closely here is that real, or is that a function of some drier weather, or just getting lucky on a few storms? So, I mean, because if this is becoming sort of the new norm, and these things are behind us, then you got some growing room, which would be fantastic news, because I will tell you that when we think about funding and expenditures, wastewater capacity is super expensive, and it would be by far the thing that shines the brightest in your future capital expenditures when the time comes. So, I mean, the good news here is that even in the absence of these couple of years here, you're certainly not in a bad place from your wastewater capacity perspective. And quite frankly, as you add houses here or there, I mean, things are not likely to change very quickly. And we'll talk more about this later, but when we start thinking about future expansion or future growth, you start thinking about the west end or out on Lake Road and inducing some growth, that's when we got to start asking, okay, how much do we really have, and do we have room, and when do we need to do something about it, all right? So, not a bad picture here. Again, we'll keep an eye on it and see what happens, but it looks like you might have a little bit of runway here before you really have to go do something significant. We'll see.
That's good news.
Any questions about wastewater plant capacity before I move? All right. Switching to water, don't need to read this either. The same message is that the state gives us some guidelines on when you need more water plant capacity. And so I don't have the same cool chart for that, but I'll just review the numbers for you with you. So over at your water plant, you've got a plant capacity of 2.8 million gallons a day, all right? You still got a very similar 80-90 rule for that. So if you approach 2.24 or 2.52, it starts to trigger that you need to do some things. What we see here for recent demands, everything's under 2 MGD, and your annual average is like 1.25 MGD. So a similar story on the water side, which is you've got some capacity there. Now, I would say this is true for the wastewater plant as well. Your permitted capacity is adequate, okay? But this second bullet is important. That the facilities that you do have, it's important that they continue to perform at their rated capacities, right? And so we build it, and if certain things decline in their capacity, or we have a few things that aren't working like they used to, then all of a sudden it may be rated for 2.8, or in the case of wastewater, 2.25, but if we don't take care of it and keep it working, then maybe we can't realize that. So it's absolutely imperative that our R&R, our rehab and rehabilitation program, keep up with the facilities that we have. And then the last bullet, which is true again for both plants, is that the timing of growth is going to really dictate your expansion needs. And again, think about that wastewater chart. If the west end happens tomorrow afternoon and Lake Road happens Friday afternoon, we have a lot of growth we're going to have to deal with. If those things don't happen for 12, 15 years, then the story's different, right? So that, I mean, it's the timing of those types of things is going to be a big factor in how quickly you have a real need for expansion, all right? I'm going to switch gears off of the plants for a second, but before I do, I'm going to go back to the R&R and some of the other things that we need to be thinking about for the facilities. And I know this might be a little bit of maybe a sore spot for some folks, but like on the wastewater side, like SCADA and control and some automation. I mean, those are the kind of things that, in spite of the fact, thankfully looks like we don't need to rush into an expansion tomorrow with a wastewater plant. Those are the kind of things we need to be thinking about investing in those so that we can be sure that that thing continues to run like it needs to run and we can monitor it and it can be reliable. So there are, I don't want to paint the picture that there's not some needs of these facilities that are not insignificant. There are needs. And we need to be thinking about those and prioritizing those, and we've talked some about how to do that. But jumping out there with an expansion is not the same. A similar thing on the water plant are some wells. I understand that there's some wells that maybe aren't performing like they once did. We need to think through that and see what we need to do. So there's stuff to do there to take care of these things and be sure they're reliable, but not necessarily the expansion right now. Any questions about water or wastewater plant capacity stuff before I move on to collection? You all saw this slide earlier this year when we were in for the retreat. John Sorrell came in, talked about asset management and some of the tiered approaches to help deal with the wastewater collection. And I just put two of those slides up here tonight just to remind us. Kind of a tiered approach. This high-level box, you may remember the dashboard we talked about. That work is underway. That is going to really just facilitate us understanding how the system is performing. And so that's not a huge lift, and that work is underway. There's a flow metering item that we suggested so we can start to understand where the flow is coming from. When we do have wet weather flows, is it coming from over here or over there, and what is its magnitude? That is something that we do recommend and will be very important here in the coming really 6 months or so to try to get our arms around. I will say that we admittedly really didn't want to do much of that work until we got the current ongoing project in service, because we wanted to capture that flow metering, quite frankly, with the new system components. And so we're there now. Actually, within the last few days, I think we had the piece tied in there. So we're teed up to get that going here, hopefully before too many months. We get into targeted inspections. Okay, this is CCTV stuff. This is, you all have your CCTV truck, you go out, you inspect sewers, you find problems, and that is the nature of this. But what this really is a more routine, systematic, larger scale program that will inspect larger chunks of the system than you can do with your own staff. But again, we get on a program, we get ahead of the game, and then we start making some inroads, and then you have a data review, and it ends up being sort of a cycle. This slide right here is another slide that you saw earlier in the year. And the gist here is that we're sitting back here at 2024, all right? And we're still playing a little bit of catch up here on our asset management. But if we'll continue to implement those things that we talked about doing, then we can start to learn the system, we can identify some urgent repairs, we can start to be a little bit more proactive. And then when you get out here in years really 3, 4, 5, and 6, the idea is that we're being a lot more proactive, a lot less reactive. Now, back to the funding piece, when we start looking for problems, we will find them, right? And so we just got to be prepared for that and fund it. I will say though that the area of the sewer that over the last couple of years has been replaced over there in that sort of parallel to 70 over by Judge Branch is in a pretty undesirable spot from a wet condition. So I'm really cautiously optimistic that low lower flow that we saw in that first graph is something that'll ring true here for time to come. We're going to see, but I'm cautiously optimistic that we're going to see some nice data. There again, there's plenty to do and invest in to maintain the system for sure, and we're trying to get our arms around that. I do not have a slide for the water system because, quite frankly, the water system is a slightly different animal. There are certainly needs, and you get into line breaks and stuff like that, but the R&R needs on the water system, at least so far, don't appear to be anywhere close to what we have in the sewer system. And so for right now, fortunately, that's not something that we're having to spend too much time trying to identify needs for. All right, and then the last two slides I got, and then we'll hand it over to others. This is a master planning map that you can see of the entire city that we did some years ago. This is the wastewater system, and the water system map right behind it doesn't look terribly different. The bottom line is, and I alluded to this, is that we've got some infill opportunities and some growth and stuff here, but your real expansion of service is out to the west and out to Lake Road. And so, I mean, I've already said it, this is just a picture of it. The same is true for the water side. The little bulbs are out on there as well. But what happens here and what happens here, by and large, are going to drive the timing for when you have to spend big money on expansion. All right. And we've got some ideas based on information we've heard from each of these folks in years past. But we've also been talking about this for years, and Craven 38 has been different sizes over the years. And so when the rubber hits the road and folks are ready to do something, we'll size up what the needs are and what they plan to bring to us, and we can start to see what that's going to do to us. All right. Any questions about that before I hand it off to the?
I was looking forward to the west end being first, but now with I-42 and the flyover there, that puts them the farthest away from us. Because they can't develop that property until DOT finishes their curlicues going across the highway there.
But these folks?
Roundabouts, yeah.
No,
The other one's
West
west.
end, yeah.
Staley Pines.
So I would say that Craven 38 is probably going to come quicker because the bypass of that area is 100% done.
Yeah. Yeah, and engineers need to stay in engineering and not in like preferences or opinions for the most part. But that's certainly a more favorable spot to try to serve by the city than the west end. So if they're coming first, that wouldn't break my heart.
Tyrone?
So you say that you already have some flow meters actually installed?
We do not have flow meters installed.
We do not have flow meters.
That's right. We will, now that the line project is done,
Okay.
when we get to a good wet season that's got some reliable wet weather, we would be advocating to put some flow meters in so we can see what's cooking.
Okay, all right,
Yep.
And that is the plan.
Yeah.
all right.
So Tom, we've done flow meters before.
Yes.
And you have all that data. Is that scrap data now, or will you compare that to what you gather with the new pipe?
Yeah, that's a good question. We'll put some meters back in some of the same locations that we've had them in the past and compare before and after, so we can see kind of what the bottom line flows are. That will be of interest. But I mean, that's probably a couple of three, but there's some other flow meters upstream that we would want to put in, back up closer to Pine View, maybe up towards Brown, to see kind of what's going on there. But I would say that, so this is pretty interesting. And we have the dashboard we talked about earlier. The dashboard is going to take your pump station runtime data, and it'll help us to understand how those pump stations react to wet weather. I mean, it's very revealing. And most of your system, most of this system is served by pump stations. And so while they don't have meters on them, it's really pretty revealing what happens in rain by just looking at the response. Okay,
Sure.
just a relative response. Very, very helpful. This part of your system is the gravity part of the system that we don't have that pump station signature for. And so this down in here is where we would scatter out the meters to try to understand within that gravity system, where do we have some bad actors? So, good thought on that.
All right, other questions for Tom? No? All right, Tom.
All right.
Yes, you're secured for now. Thank you, Tom.
So everybody, I'm Justin Nolan. I'm the project director over at the UNC Environmental Finance Center. Come out and talk to you a little bit about the finances that we've seen going on in Havelock. I want to let you guys know, we talk to towns all over North Carolina. This is a conversation we are having with dozens and dozens of towns at any given time, so a lot of what you guys are seeing is pretty universal, which you may already know, but I thought it was worth verbalizing. So we're going to look at 6 different pieces. First, the current hurdles. I just want to talk to you guys, re-emphasize the unique position that Havelock finds itself in as a coastal community from a financial perspective, running a water utility. We're going to walk through the financial health assessment, which is kind of an overview of where Havelock's utilities, water utilities finances are right now, and what we kind of are projecting based on the current year's budget. Alicia's going to talk a little bit about the rates analysis, kind of looking at the changes you've made to rates, where we think that the dent that's going to make. Talk a little bit about community trust building, some future funding opportunities, and just the significance of this conversation overall. So I want to start out by talking about the situation. Havelock is in a unique position because, like I said, it's a coastal community. Coastal communities across North Carolina facing more intense weather, increased rainfall. Blessedly, this year has been a low hurricane year, but it's a uniquely low hurricane year. I know it might not feel like it, but we're seeing increased number of hurricanes. So the basic takeaway from that is, water utilities are always going to feel the direct impact of significant rain events, and hurricanes produce significant rain events. So you have a water utility that has over half, and when I say reached the end of its useful life, I'm saying, from a financial perspective. So over half of Havelock's water and wastewater infrastructure has reached the end of its useful life as determined by its depreciation as an asset. The infrastructure that does exist wasn't built in a context that you are experiencing. In other words, the infrastructure that is in the ground right now, most of it was built in a context where you weren't getting this many hurricanes every year and you weren't experiencing this many significant rainfall events. And like I said, there's an increased precipitation. So what that means is you're running a business, and that business, the cost of running that business has escalated dramatically. And you guys are kind of having to adapt to that reality. And very little of that is under your control because you don't control the weather. But it's not unique to you guys. So we've seen the state and the federal government roll out several programs acknowledging that all of these things are realities, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. So I just want to go through where this has left you financially from the perspective of the utility. We're going to start with the water utility, then we're going to talk about the wastewater utility. We're keeping their finances separate because arguably the water utility is in a better place financially than the sewer utility is. So we're going to break this down by key performance indicators. In this case, we're going to start with operating ratio, and the big idea here is just, on a very basic level, are we making enough money at the water utility to keep the lights on? Now, this graph is showing you from 2019 to 2023. That's based on the audited financials that we've received. So this is, verified the experiences. And overall, from this period, from 2019 to 2023, you guys were doing fantastic, staying above board. We look for a 1.0. We'd like to see 1.2, and you guys we're even nailing that. Unfortunately, when we bounce over to the projected operating ratio of the water utility based on the current budget, you're going to fall below that line of 1.0. So historically, Havelock has had a really good operating ratio, but operating expenses are expected to increase significantly in this current fiscal year, which is going to result in a situation where you guys are, in the absence of significant changes, and I think you've already started making those changes, ending up in a situation where you're not making as much money as you're spending on a very basic level. Again, when you see that word projected at the upper right, that's me talking about budget, not audited financials. From a debt service ratio, let me pause. Anybody have any questions on operating ratio? All right. Our second indicator is the debt service ratio. We're looking at, can we cover the debts that we have? Again, historically, Havelock has been extraordinarily good. The Havelock water utility has been extraordinarily good in this department. You guys well above the debt service coverage ratio. But again, we find ourselves in a situation where the projected debt service coverage ratio drops precipitously. A lot of this just has to do with that expenses again. If you're having to spend more money, the ratio of how much you're having to spend versus how much debt you have is going to change. That's what you're going to be seeing here. So the recent rate increases are going to definitely ameliorate this to a certain extent, but we also have to think about exactly what he was just talking about. Is any capital project that you guys want to engage in going forward is going to push it the opposite direction. So rates increases are going to help, but when you start trying to fix the fact that a lot of your water utility is getting really, really, really old, that's going to make it worse. So that's going to shift in the opposite direction. Any questions on debt service coverage ratio? Okay. The quick ratio is, can we pay our bills with the money we have on hand? That's really just looking at the money that the utility has built up in case of crisis situations. Again, healthy and in a pretty good position. So this is even taking into account the projections going into 2024. The quick ratio looks pretty good. I want to shift this over though, the days cash on hand, which is how many days can we operate with the money we have right now. That one is going to decline a little. You guys have been in an extremely healthy place with your days cash on hand. I can't tell you, across North Carolina, there are very few water utilities that are in this position, but you guys have had to spend a lot of unexpected money on dealing with sanitary sewer overflows and various other crises. Obviously, that's not going to affect the water side as much, but you are dealing with a lot of unexpected expenses because of these high rainfall events, because of other things that are going on with your utility, which is diminishing the days cash on hand. If that trend continues and you hit that point at 200, that's where you're looking at, we can't keep our lights on for 200 days if we're in a particularly bad situation. So that's something to keep an eye on. All right, this is the last big indicator. This is the capital assets depreciated. This is what I was talking about earlier when I said the end of their useful life. So expected useful life. Any piece of your infrastructure, any piece of the water infrastructure is going to have a cost value associated with it. Obviously, when it's brand new, the cost value is just the thing. But just like a car loses its value as soon as it drives off the lot, your utilities pieces are going to depreciate over time. And on a very basic level, that can be used as a measurement of how old the stuff that's in the ground is. How old is the utility itself? We like to see water utilities stay around 30%, 35% depreciated assets, meaning just over a third of all of their stuff has reached the end of its useful life. In the case of Havelock's water, that is closer to 50%. And obviously the projection isn't nearly as dire in that situation because what that just is going to equate to is just another year of age. You don't have a bunch of stuff that's suddenly way older, but it is moving in the wrong direction. So again, what that means is you're going to need to spend money to replace that stuff, which affects all of the other things we're talking about. And this isn't because there's any mistake that's been made. It's just literally these things are old and have to be replaced after a certain amount of time. So just considering that anything above 30% is considered suboptimal, and you guys are pushing 60% for 2024, where 2/3 of the stuff that you guys got going on is going to be depreciated. Switching over to before I go any further, any questions on the water utility finances? I'm sure you guys are fairly familiar with these numbers. All right, wastewater utility, kind of similar. Although operating ratio for the sewer utility, which has had a little bit more struggle than the water utility, has been was on the correct trend, was on the upward trend, but recent projections are going to put it deeply underneath that line of making enough money to stay open. Again, this is correlated with rising expenses for the sewer. Again, current rate changes should help, but this is where you're headed without any changes made. This is just based on the budget. Debt service coverage ratio. You guys obviously paid off some debt on the wastewater side from 2009 to 2020. You got pretty much to the point where you were in a pretty comfortable position. However, the debt service coverage ratio, again, is likely to decline, and that goes back to, again, the same factors that affect the water utility, just expenses. Quick ratio, still staying pretty fluid. It's healthy, but the fluidity is reducing. They have less money to play with right now than they have before. Days cash on hand, you guys are seeing a trend right now. So again, recent projections put you guys at a position where, you know, if you weren't taking in any more money, the sewer utility would only have about 100 days of runway, which is super unsustainable in the long run. And then the percent capital assets depreciated. This one's even more significant than the other side of things. We have 50% in 2019. By 2024, I apologize for the graph flipping upside down, but again, it's approaching 60%. It's probably a little bit older than the water utility, which will, again, require capital improvement projects to fix. So I know I've said a whole lot of stuff here, but the big takeaway that I really want you to get from all these just financial numbers is the last year or so has significantly derailed the financial position of both the water and wastewater utility. Havelock is existing in a geographic space that has become a more expensive geographic space to run a water utility, and is dealing with unique pressures that other parts of the state and other part of the country just don't have to deal with. You know, pick your hazard: hurricanes, increased rainfall, saltwater intrusion, across the board. All of those things cost money and will require you guys to be proactive, exactly as the engineering team has talked about. And rates will likely need to be steadily increased over the next 10 years to combat. You guys are fighting both inflation and depreciation. So just the general cost of things being more expensive, and also the fact that the water utility is getting older and falling apart. Both those things have to be dealt with. You also have severely dented your utility's fluidity. In other words, you spend a lot of your cash on hand to deal with urgent crisis moments, and you would like to get back to a position where you can deal with other crisis moments if you're going to have to deal with them.
Yeah.
And you need to update your infrastructure. And it might not be as big as a whole wastewater treatment facility kind of update your infrastructure, but certainly getting ahead of the problems instead of constantly having. On a general rule of thumb, reactivity is a lot more expensive than proactivity. It doesn't always feel like it, but you end up spending much more money on the back end. So before we get to the rates analysis, any questions about just the general state of water and wastewater finances?
You, board, any questions? All right, I have a few for you, Justin, before we jump on.
Yeah.
So on the, just for context purposes, since you guys look at this stuff in multiple places, the capital assets depreciation that you see in water and sewer, so I guess one question for both of them, is being off that threshold pretty common? I mean, I feel like most systems around us are at 50, 60 or better. Not that we like
No,
it.
that's a great question. So yes, across North Carolina, very few systems, we're kind of at a reckoning point right now. Like I said, we work with dozens of programs, dozens of systems. Many of them are desperately trying to deal with the consequences of having gotten to the point where they're at 50 or 60%. Yeah, that's very common. But in every situation, the reason they've called us in is because having gotten to that point, they have really bad problems. You know, they have increased flooding, they have unsustainable levels of I&I, they have, pick your poison. And it all comes back to, we didn't want to raise rates for 15 or 16 years. So now we either have to jump this huge rates increase, or we have to scramble to find funding, or whatever, please help us find funding. Which is, luckily, I mean, that's what we do. But the point is, like, that is yes, it's common, but it's common in like the worst possible way. And it's part of the reason why the bipartisan infrastructure law was put in place, was because America's infrastructure is getting old.
I was going to say, it's not just North Carolina either.
Yeah, no, absolutely not. We work with the entire Southeast. So this is everywhere.
And so to the board, I asked that question as context, not as an excuse to say, oh, we're like everyone else, we can let that go, because I think you guys still have to set a standard for what you want, or what your priority is, your level of service, so staff can implement to that level. But I did want to put that in context, because as you guys know, at every listening session for the last 2 years, I have told all the public that we are no different than everyone else. Boards in the past have kicked this can down the road because, believe it or not, contrary to popular belief among our citizens, we toil a lot over what to charge for water and sewer, and we're consistently undercharging. in order not to affect your citizens, and then this is where you end up. It's easy because the infrastructure is hidden. You don't have to look at it, right? And so you can say, oh, out of sight, out of mind, it still works. We can ignore it. The other question, so I understand. Yes, please.
One thing I just want to also add to that is that you guys, like I kind of alluded to, you guys more than everybody else also deal with unique weather hazards that make kicking it down the road like even more of a potential issue, and can make, when things start to get really old, they can make those glaring issues like very obvious very abruptly.
Right, like, I mean, I&I is a great example, right? I&I, if you're in a dry area of the state, not a big deal. I&I, if you get it here, you know, one hurricane event, that shows up like a huge
Infiltration, inflows, water getting into your pipes.
The other thing that I just want to add too is that, so when I look at this, so your days cash on hand, you guys are like for the last 5 years, right? 19 to 23, you guys are super high. And in some cases, I actually look at that and I'm like, you actually have too much cash. I want to see you guys spending that cash on your infrastructure because of this very thing, right? That your assets are depreciated. But because you're having to spend this money in a reactive way, as this cash on hand is going down, your assets aren't going down, right? Like you're not actually able to do those improvements. So if I had seen the cash go down, but this jump up because you've replaced some of those things that need replacing, I'd be like, yep, A++, right? You've used that cash in a productive way to get those assets back to kind of less depreciated because you'd be replacing things. But since I'm not seeing that, that's what causes the bigger flag, right? Is that you're having to react and spend more money on the reactivity than the productivity. But you're right, this isn't uncommon. We see this all over the place, unfortunately.
I'm tracking on that. I think my last question right now is, so on the wastewater one, I completely understand the comment of operating expenses are expected to increase significantly over the next year, and as a result, you know, we're going to see those quick ratios and operating ratios change. On the water system, though, we haven't, I mean, while our numbers have changed in a downward trend minor over the last few years, what is driving, like on that, I think it might be your first slide, where it's operating expenses are expected to increase significantly during this fiscal year, which is showing our operating ratio projected to drop below that one threshold. What's driving that? Was that something we gave them, or was that something you guys saw that we did? Because the water system, that hasn't been something that's been raising alarm. That was the only thing that caught my attention.
All right, so our numbers are purely the result of looking at the projected expenses on the budget.
Yeah,
So you mean like cost of chemicals even, or are you talking about rising inflation costs, or?
This would just be, so the 19 to 23 are using your audited financials. So these like accountants have already gone through, versus 24, this projected year, is using kind of estimated numbers. So it could be that those numbers are going to shift a little bit once the auditor finishes the audit.
Okay.
So I'm making sure that we take those numbers with a grain of salt.
And yeah, understood.
That's kind of what I was getting at. Can I take them? I mean,
I wouldn't say totally take them with a grain of salt, but
Okay.
they definitely might not be as severe as, we want to give you a worst case scenario.
Okay, well that's what we're used to, and that's why I asked that, because I mean that is kind of what we expect of our staff when we're talking about the financial things. Is our revenue is always underestimated, and our expenses, we always try to look at the worst case scenario. So
Right.
understood.
Yeah.
Kimberly?
I was just gonna say, when we were giving those numbers, when we were in that budget time, we weren't anticipating the departments spending the amount that they had because they still had so much year left to go, and we didn't know exactly where we were gonna end up.
Okay, understood. That was the only thing that jumped out at me as a little bit like I wasn't expecting. So
No, but we definitely want to put, I mean, this first indicator is the first indicator for a reason, right? Like
Sure.
operating ratio is, and that's if you're running a lemonade stand and you're not making as much money as you're spending, you're not going to stay open for long. So we definitely put it out front, and worst case scenario, we're wrong and you guys are in better shape. That would be great.
okay. Any other questions y'all thought of while we were running through those?
And as soon as the audit
Okay.
is done, we can update these numbers too, so you have a better sense of fiscal year 24.
Okay. And if you don't know, we do our audit really, really fast. We might have those numbers in like very soon, right?
Brilliant.
Kimberly?
I love that.
Oh yeah, we're early auditors, man. We don't mess around.
That's great. All right, so I'm just going to touch base on the rates analysis that we did. All right, so just as some background knowledge, just putting up the number of customers that you guys have that were included in the rates analysis. You guys do track your residential, commercial, and institutional users, but you're not charging based on that. You're charging based on the pipe size. So just highlighting your inside 3 1/4 inch That's your biggest group of folks there with about 5,000. Those other there are there if you want to reference them at any point. So you guys did do some rate increases in 2025, which I know can be hard on the public side, and we can talk through some of those challenges and how we can do communication with the public and community so that there's some better understanding. But you did do the 10% increases on both the base and the volumetric, and that was on the water, and it was 25% on the sewer. I didn't put that in there, sorry. And then your current steps, you guys have an allowance of 1,000. No, we decided that was not the case. I'm so sorry. I need to change that and get that back to you guys. But then you have these other steps at 3,000, 6,000, 9,000 gallons. So those are just how the rate structure is changing. You guys have increased volumetric charges at those greater gallons.
And so for everybody up here, if you don't remember, the average house is in that 3,001 to 6,000 range.
Yeah.
Your single, your people that live by themselves, or maybe just a couple, might be under that 3,000 more constantly, but our average is 5,000. So most people with a family are in the 3,000 to 6,000, that second tier.
Great, thank you for that. That is helpful. Okay, so I did pull up some consumption histograms. So what this is just showing is, is this the green, the little?
That's the one that blows it all up. So.
Yeah. Okay. So the consumption histograms is basically showing, like you were just indicating, right? Like maybe I'm a household of 4, I'm consuming 4,000, and so I'm actually in this like 4 to 5,000. So this is the number of customers that are falling within each of these buckets of consumption per month. So you see here on this 3/4 inch, which is most likely to be residential, you've got kind of the 0 to 1,000, a good chunk of folks here. The biggest chunk is, you know, the 1,000 to 3,000, and then kind of gradually dropping off, right? You don't have as many folks that are using more than 12,000 gallons a month in that user group. On the 1 to 6 inch, right, which is going to be more likely to be your commercial institutional folks, you still have some here at this lower level, but you've got a lot more users that are coming in at that 12,000 a month. And then your sewer only, I popped up here because you do have 100 folks in there. And you can see this pretty similar here with the 3/4 inch, right, that you've got, most folks are using at that lower level. Now, the reason I wanted to throw this in here is because if at any point, one of the things that we do is we come in and show you like, this is what you're doing, but if you want to make any changes, if you're trying to focus on affordability or business-friendly practices or conservation, right, there's different ways that you can structure your rates, right? You just did a 10% increase and 25%. I'm not gonna tell you to change them right now, but if there are other things you guys want to focus on, want to prioritize, we can run through all these different scenarios and the tools that we have to show you other options, right? So if we're concerned about your bringing in some additional money to be able to pay for some of these infrastructure challenges, it might make sense for you guys to switch, because you guys are tracking residential, commercial, institutional, it might make sense to switch and instead of charging by the pipe size, to instead charge by the user type. So you can see here residential is falling very much in that 3/4 inch, so that same kind of display, right, where we've got 1 to 3,000 is most common and very few here above 12,000. But if you jump over to the commercial and the institutional, which is just 18 folks, so just making sure you realize the sample size is much smaller here, but you have much greater usage of these high categories, right? So if you're concerned about conservation at all, if you're concerned about trying to bring in some more money, it could be that you're changing your rate structure to try to get, you know, some additional funds from this high bracket, maybe from the commercial institutional side that can afford it, rather than some of the residential folks or folks that are on limited income. So just throwing that out there as things to be thinking about as you're looking at rates. Not saying you should do this, it's really up to you guys, but just something that I observed when I was looking at this.
I don't think we've ever done it that way before, have we?
No.
Not as long as I've ever. Interesting.
Which is interesting because I would say most folks that we work with split it on like the type of user. So residential, commercial. Instead
of the tiered rate for just gallons and size of pipe, you would have a different price set for your commercial, a different price set for your institutional based on gallon.
Yeah, I would even just like remove the pipe size completely.
Just drop all that?
Yeah, and you just do like residential, commercial, institutional, or even just commercial, institutional as one. And then like inside, outside tends to be the other denominator that we see of, just because it's your closer proximity, it's easier to get it's, you know, easier to get water and collect wastewater from folks that are within the boundaries. So those tend to be the two that we see breakdowns most often. Some food for thought for you guys. Okay, so the analysis that we did uses 11 months of billing data, August of 23 to June 24. I just want to highlight that we're likely underestimating the consumption, which means that we're actually underestimating the revenue because we're missing key warm month of July, right? So with 12 months of data, we get a little bit more picture, but just highlighting that this revenue is probably a little bit lower because people are consuming a little bit more in July typically. I did build in a 5% increase year over year, just to try to show kind of what that would look like. And then a few assumptions that we include in our tool is this 2% of uncollected bills per year. Some folks have more around 1, but we try to, again, kind of buffer to expect a little bit worse of a scenario. We do build in a negative average consumption per year, so that's a change. So you think about people putting in more efficient washers, dishwashers, those sorts of things are gonna just kind of generally decrease consumption. We also put in a reduction, so it's a negative 3% because it's a reduction, sorry, with a 10% increase in rates. So what we've seen is that if you build up rates, you know, keep boosting them up, people are likely to be going to be conserving a little bit more. So we build in a little bit of that negative consumption to account for that kind of conservation even within their own home. And I have built in a 5% inflation also on the expense side because we need to be realistic that you guys are facing the same inflation rates that all of us are, and actually on the construction side even more so. So I'm making sure that that's consistent. And then this is just, sorry, this is the same number of customers here, but I just wanted to show that I have included just mild growth here, and this is based on the numbers of customers that you guys have seen over the last year. So we've just got negative 2.2% for those inside 3/4 inch, and then we've got 2 positive ones here, that 1 inch and that 2 inch. But otherwise, I've kept it at 0. And this is something, if you guys are experiencing growth and you feel like, well, let's actually include a little bit more because we think that we've got more growth, or hang on, we don't have that much growth, we can adjust these so that you can kind of see over time what you think is going to happen. I have not included any connection or late penalty fees, so that's another little bucket that will add a little bit of revenue that I haven't included just to kind of be on the safe side of the revenue.
I got a question.
Go ahead, Joe.
Yeah, go ahead, just jump in.
So like for those cities that actually do the rates separately than the way we do it, do they tend to see, and I know this is generalization, but do they tend to see the residential rates be lower or higher on average than a system like this?
Typically, the residential rates would be lower than the commercial and industrial because most of the folks doing this are trying to think about affordability,
Right.
fixed income, right? They're really trying to be cognizant of folks that it's harder versus a business, which of course lots of small businesses could still struggle with budgeting, but they're able to adjust, you know, their annual budgets to try to account for some of those changes a little bit more easily. Or some of the bigger industrial folks, or your schools, things like that, right? There's more creative ways to kind of work with those rates versus a resident, which has a little bit more of a challenge.
Mr. Manager, can we do a fee change? I'm sorry, I'm trying to remember. Can we do a fee change throughout the year, or is this one of the ones that's tied to the budget?
This is tied to the budget.
Gotcha.
But we can, you know, if that's something you guys are interested in kind of playing with, that's something that we can easily kind of run a few scenarios to help show you what that might look like. Especially since you're already tracking the residential commercial, that makes it a lot easier for me to just go ahead and plug in and see what we can come up with if that's of interest.
Right. I know I'd be interested.
Okay, great. Okay, so on the water utility side, this is the staying with the existing rates. This is blue, and this is if you were to use fiscal year 23. So this is what you guys had already been using, not including this new rate increase that you guys did. And this is if you were just staying with those existing rates, same number of customers, all those assumptions that I already made, you know, you'd be bringing in right at that kind of break-even point. And then this is with those new rates, which is good. So we're seeing above the expense line with the new rates, the increase that you guys just did, which I love. This is ideal. If I had all my towns like this, it'd be great. However, this is using the expenses from fiscal year 2023. Now, what Justin was just showing you is that they're not complete audited financials, right? So we have to take that with a grain of salt. But if we put in the expenses from fiscal year 24, which were kind of projected, we're now kind of missing that mark, right? There was a big increase in expenses on the water side by about $1.5 million. So this is where it's like, well, okay, we don't have the audited financials, so this isn't exact, but seeing this makes me feel like, okay, we're still not quite getting there if those expenses are true and you keep in that general direction. Now, if this was kind of a fluke year and your expenses go back down next year, right, then we're not gonna see this big of a discrepancy. But if the expenses kind of keep going in this direction, that's when it's gonna be a bit more of a concern.
It'd be hard to believe that it was a fluke with 60% of our, you've got 60% of, depreciated assets in the ground, so.
It's not a fluke.
Yeah, I was
Yeah.
gonna say, it'd be hard.
Yeah.
I mean, we did spend an exorbitant amount of money, which, hopefully, as we've been talking about since the retreat, we're changing the trajectory of that, right? But it's not gonna be abrupt, right? That trajectory is gonna change over a 5, 6, 8 year period, not over a 1 or 2 year period.
Yeah.
Josh?
No, you answered my question.
Okay.
So while the increase it helps, right? This doesn't feel, it feels trivial based on the size of the bars, but the increase helps. And like I said, this is a built-in 5% increase over the years. So, if you stick with this kind of trajectory with the expenses, right, those 5% increases year over year help, but they're not still quite getting you to the expenses, especially if you think I've built in 5% on inflation, right? There's that 5% on the increased bills right there. So that's on the water side. And then on the wastewater side, we're seeing kind of a similar picture here. This is basically the old rates. This is the new rates here. Again, I love to see this kind of going above the expenses. And then with those fiscal year 24 projected expenses, your expenses in 24 were over $4 million more on the wastewater side. So this is, this then becomes kind of a big jump, right? To go from about $5 million to almost $10 million, that's a pretty big jump to cover. So again, we'll, once we take a look at the audited financials, that'll give us a little bit better picture. But there's some kind of room for concern, I would say, here based on the most recent expenses. Okay, other questions on rates? And this is a functional, modifiable tool, right? So as many scenarios as you guys want me to plug in or you guys to fiddle with, I'm happy to do so. So this is really kind of an iterative process, up to you guys, and we can try to see, like, can we get closer in this way or change it in this way to try to get closer?
So from that perspective, I don't know if there's a cart before the horse. So if the board said, once we got the 2024 audit done,
Yeah.
you plug those numbers in and we can see that a little bit more definitively.
Yeah.
The board said our goal is to meet the needs of expenses, which technically we should be over that, right?
Yeah.
But because if you're just meeting the needs of expenses, then we're not ready for whatever's about to happen. So
That's right.
let's just say the board said we want to at least hit that red line.
Yep.
Can you then reverse engineer what that looks like every year for rate change?
Yep.
Versus, I guess, the other side, if the board came in and they said, our palette is, I'll just make some up, no more than 8% a year,
Sure.
period.
Yeah.
You can do it from that direction too and
Yep.
say, well, that's where it lines you up?
Yep, yeah,
Okay,
absolutely.
so they can do it from either or both directions once
Yep.
you've got the final data to say.
Yeah.
I mean, we went through this, I don't know, 20 years ago, 15 years ago. And it wasn't from both directions, so it was like, hey, if you want to meet it, here's your number. And the number was like everyone fell out of their chair crazy. And so then what the city did back then was they said, well, what's palatable?
Yeah.
And we kind of, the board at the time just picked percentages and
Yeah.
went through that. But it didn't cover the full gap,
Yeah.
right? Because the gap was defined here and we weren't willing to meet the gap.
Yeah.
But I think it would be good to see it both ways. If they say, well, you need to do 12% a year. I made that up. It could be 18% a year. I don't know. It could be 4% a year. But whatever, it won't be 4%. Whatever it is, you could say that's untenable. What happens if we do this?
Yeah.
How far are we off our mark?
Yeah. Well, and I think once we get those confirmed audit numbers, we can go back to that debt service coverage ratio, because for me, when I see, this, and I hear about some of the expenses that you guys are having that's pushing those expense numbers higher, I think about, well, is there a way that we can find some funding to cover some of these bigger projects that's gonna reduce your expenses. It's very hard typically to reduce expenses. But if you guys are having reactive expenses, is there a way that we can get some funding, replace some of these areas where you're having those reactive expenses? And you can cover the debt through rates, right? That's gonna be much easier to cover that debt payment, annual debt payment through rates versus a $4 million increase in expenses per year. That's gonna be much harder to cover. 200,000 you can cover in your rates, right? But 4 million is a lot harder.
And so, board, we've talked about that with the perspective of the shot in the arm, right? If you identify these projects, just absolutely, if you took these off your plate, that would make a huge difference, but it's going to take this much debt service to do that. And then what does that look like? So she's saying they can help, figure that out. If you said we can get this much shot in the arm, and what does that look like to our rate, and how does that adjust it?
Okay, so I wanted to talk a little bit about just interaction with the community and other funding things, and I just wanted to just kind of an all-inclusive statement. I really like what the engineering firm had to say about the long-term asset management plan and the capital improvement plan, the idea of getting to a point where you're thinking about the future and what you're going to need to do every year to keep your system in a good position. One thing I just want to stress is that that is information that you should, if you can, be putting out in the public as much as you possibly can. I think that part of this whole problem is that people don't necessarily associate their water utility with being theirs. But it's very much like your schools and your roads. This is your water and the quality of your water, and you're paying into a pool to keep that water healthy. It's the ownership that I think can sometimes be something, it's a culture of ownership that I think can sometimes really help make these conversations more palatable. You guys are kind of in this thing together, and if it falls apart on you, you're in a much worse place. There are places in the United States where people are straight piping their water into the woods behind their house because their water utility has fallen apart so much that they just have nothing to work with. So I just wanted to put that out there. Raising rates with intentionality, with a particular target in mind. When we talk to DEQ, Department of Environmental Quality, about what they're looking for, what they want to see from utilities, what they want to see in order to grant funding, what they want to see the implementation of these long-term improvement plans. And that is partially a communication plan. That is partially, we're going to explain all of what are we doing in the next 10 years? What is our team where is our team going as a whole community? This is why we're doing that. This is what we're seeing that is going to cause that. This is the age of these pieces that is going to necessitate that. They want to see, they don't just want to see you make a capital improvement plan and then it just hangs out somewhere and then you had it, check box. They want to see how is that working into the way that you're changing the way your water utility behaves. You guys, more so than other water utilities in North Carolina, have to be prepared for crisis and saving for capital improvement to deal with the climate resiliency and adaptation that is unique to your area. There are partners in the state, which I'm going to get to in a second. There are partners in the state that will help you with that. So it's not just on your own back, but it is something to be considering. And the last piece of this is that, and this is something you can also be very real with your customers about, is that, utilities that totally neglect this sort of process and totally neglect, get to the point where their water utility is totally insolvent, do get taken over by the state. That is that's a real reality that we work with on a regular basis. They can Google it real quick.
At which point a municipality now has zero control over their rates.
Correct. And the first thing that LGC is going to do every single time, and I talked to these gentlemen about this earlier, they're going to raise your rates to the point where your utility is solvent again, which is going to be a lot more abrupt and a lot more painful and a lot more uncomfortable because they don't have to deal with whether or not they're going to get re-voted in. They are, they are immune to that sort of. So but the stuff we can solve in-house is going to be the best possible outcome for everybody. So again, towns frequently attempt to avoid raising rates by using state funding or hoping for political earmarks or finding grants. And we will help you guys do those things, and there are grants for you to pursue. But it's a big pie, right? And part of it is rate increases, and part of it is grants, and part of it is reducing expenses. And that whole thing together is what's going to get you guys where you need to go. So it's no one piece. Yes, sir.
So on the grants and raising rates, the state's not going to have grants for every local municipality, but can the state actually help carve out loans for actual municipalities to actually apply for?
100%. And your water utility has applied for some of those, and they're competitive. So going back to his question earlier, we said, communities all across North Carolina have gotten to the point where their water utility is above 60% to asset depreciation. There's a high level of competition, which is why it's so important to pool resources and get as many heads in the game as possible so that when you put forward your grant application, it gets approved. But yet, state revolving fund loan and or grant money is available. I was talking to Chris earlier about the RCCP, or the Resilient Coastal Communities Program, which is all the Canada counties have access to. There's a number. I mean, you could potentially even go after a BRIC loan, especially which is a federal loan through FEMA, based on what you've been experiencing in terms of all the coastal hazard that you guys deal with. And SRF will match, state revolving fund will match a BRIC loan. So there's a matching requirement for BRIC that you can hit there. Yes, sir.
And one of the other things that we'll be talking to the board about at a later date in a little more detail is currently we do a 5-year CIP. We get 0 points for that on these applications. We've got to present to you and talk through what it looks like to do a 10-year CIP. I don't know what the total points is for that, but I know it's considerably more points than 0.
So if you guys get to the point where you have a 10-year, especially asset management plan, so you're doing the holistic process, that is 10 points. To put this in perspective, competitive score on a state revolving fund loan is about 54. All right, so 10 points is huge. 10 points is that gets you almost a quarter of the way there. It's a significant amount, and it'll apply to every single project you undertake. So if you guys have a long list of projects you want to undertake, you want to do one every year, having an updated asset management plan is just giving you those 10 points over and over and over and over and over and over again, and it's good practice. You will never keep up with the costs and issues that you're dealing with just going after them with political earmarks and grant funding. So, being as communicative as possible about why rates have to be raised is excellent. People should be all in on the same page. Everybody needs to know what's going on. But every single town we've found that is in a really bad place right now financially, a lot of it can be tied right back to we didn't want to raise rates for a decade or more.
Sure.
Okay, this is what Chris was talking about earlier. Access to state revolving fund money is directly connected to having a capital improvement plan and rates. So another thing that scores you points on that funding application is going to be whether or not your rates are where they're supposed to be. So if you are asking for grant money from the state government and they look at your rates and they're lower than what the state says that they should be, you are going to lose points there, because the first thing they're going to say is, well, before you're asking us for money, you should be raising rates in your town.
Sure. So
having rates set where they're supposed to be also helps you go after that grant money. It's a big pie. It all works together.
I mean, if I was a state, I'd feel the same way. If you're not going to do your part, why do you want me to come in and fix it for you?
Correct. Yeah. So any consistent dialogue you guys can do with the funding or with the public, I think is going to be super helpful. Rate increases are totally unavoidable, but the more we can communicate why these things are happening, the better. A lot of utilities have found a lot of success publicizing their KPIs, their key performance indicators. The stuff that I gave to you guys earlier, the long, boring part of the presentation that was all graphs, sending those out from time to time, saying like, hey guys, this is how depreciated, this is what depreciation is, and this is how depreciated our assets are, and this is why we're going to need to do some projects coming up pretty soon. Just knowing what is going on, and why do you need me to pay more money can sometimes do a lot. And not every customer can come to a public listening session, so sometimes they're confined to their house, they don't have transportation, a number of things. It can be easier to meet them where they're at. If your utility deals with, like I said, hazards that other utilities don't deal with. If you're spending money to deal with saltwater intrusion, let them know, hey, we're looking at our reservoirs and the amount of salinity in our reservoirs is going up. This is how much it's going up. This is how much that will probably cost to fix. Letting them know that's a problem, because salt water in your reservoir makes the water untenable. If you have failing pump stations, letting them know that sort of stuff, that can really help. And again, many customers, we had a woman come and speak at our big class last year from a town whose infrastructure was built before their roads were built. So when they went to replace their utility, they had wooden pipes in certain places. Customers have, and somebody mentioned this earlier, it's all underground. Customers have no idea how old their water infrastructure. And a lot of people You say, hey, the pipe that brings water to your house was built 60 years ago, and I want to replace it, and that's why you got to pay $5 extra on your water bill. They're receptive because they don't want 60-year-old pipes bringing them water. And these are just some ideas that I thought, mailers, anything on the internet where they can download the key performance indicators. Obviously, you're already doing council meetings. If you have a project in somebody's neighborhood, having a staff member on site to explain what's happening, why are we here, why are we doing this, and then just public service announcements in general. I know a lot of this stuff you guys are already doing, but anything that can help build that public trust is going to make this whole process easier. And I just want to reiterate that one more time, is that every water utility in the whole country is a business, and that business can't raise its own rates. It has to ask other people permission
Right.
too. It can't raise its own prices, and they have to be approved by a regulatory authority. And that makes it really difficult for water utilities to be successful. But unfortunately, if they remain unsuccessful for long enough, they lose their autonomy, and you guys don't want to lose your autonomy. So I feel like your utility is kind of at a crossroads. You have an excellent customer base, which means you have a lot of options. You're not a 500 town of 500 that has none. You building an asset management plan and becoming more systematic with these issues is going to help your public communication, it's going to help your financial planning, and it's going to help forecasting where your rates need to go over time, because you'll know what you need to put in the ground every year systematically. And this is our information if you'd like to contact us. Again, I'm Justin Nolan, this is Alicia Easto Fraser, and I appreciate you.
Y'all got any more questions for them?
Yeah.
So, I'll ask you this. One thing you did not cover, and I'm sure you've seen a lot of it because we've seen some in East North Carolina, are municipalities giving up their water and wastewater to these for-profit corporations. And I'm just going to tell you what we think that looks like, and you can tell us if you've seen that as the case. So everywhere around us that's happened, the rates immediately double, triple, sometimes. There's examples of 4 and 5 times increase because they're running as a for-profit corporation. Right. And then we've also seen that you give up a lot of your ability for growth because now you're dependent on them. And if you say, we've got a Craven 38 track like you saw up here earlier, we're going to need capacity for 300 new homes, they can just say no. Right. We're not willing to put that money in the infrastructure. Or yes, but we're going to raise everyone's rates by this amount. Right. So is that kind of what you see, or is there anything else you see that we should be aware of? And I only say that because every time we go to League Municipalities conferences, those guys are there.
Oh, yeah.
And they hit up every commissioner and they want to talk about what great things they can do for your system. And they can run your system really, really well. But it just costs a ton of money. That's what we've seen. So your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think the second thing you said is huge. If I'm a company and my profit share, my profit area, right, is the entire Southeast, right? And one small town in the middle of that is really concerned about its growth and where it wants to develop. But we determine that that's not the best for our profit margins. Well, that town being upset with me, that town, protesting, whatever, doesn't really affect my bottom line. My bottom line is spread out across the entire region, right? There's no incentive for me to really prioritize this town's goals. But also, it's like right now you guys are in a position where you can come to these meetings and you can hash it out and you can discuss and you can input and you can elect people and all those things. You can affect all of that. If you cede your authority to a private industry, you've immediately gotten rid of that entire dialogue. That doesn't exist anymore. So it's kind of a worst case scenario eject button option. And most of the time when I see it, it's in situations where a town is hit the point where they're trying to even regionalize. They tried to merge with another utility, and the other utility said no, and it is this or we dissolve.
I was going to say, I feel like you guys aren't in a dire enough position where it's kind of a worthwhile thing to consider, right? Where I see it successful is these tiny towns, because the companies have ways to make profit off of other places. They can kind of take on some of these smaller towns and slowly get it to be more, palatable, but they can kind of help that. Like, it's either this or you all have to go to well and septic, right? Because they're small enough towns with failing systems that really can't kind of crawl out on their own. But you guys have a customer base, right? You're big enough, you guys are in no way failing, so.
You also have some really interesting potential regionalized partnership options. So, honestly, if I was to create a scale, developing partnerships with close by municipalities to kind of share certain parts of our infrastructure is here. Going private is here, and that's just right above dissolving as a utility. Because it's the last resort.
I'm glad to hear y'all say that, because that's the way I have thought about it for the last year or two, since it became kind of trendy-ish, to not I say trendy, it became more common. And that's been my thought, is we're a long way from that, but you'll occasionally have citizens that are just like, privatize the system, and I don't think they understand the ramifications of what that means. And I think if you're the kind of community that really wants to drive what your development looks like, that's reason number one not to privatize your system. And then to have zero control over the rates. It sucks to have control over rates sometimes, I'm not gonna lie. Most every time it sucks to have control over the rates, but it doesn't mean you give that up just because it sucks. I think it's still our responsibility. You give that over to somebody else, yeah, you hit the easy button for you, but all of our rates are gonna quadruple in some cases. I mean, we've seen that in counties and municipalities around us. So it's good to hear that perspective from you guys where you see it across a larger region than we do.
It's a real strong argument that everybody who has an effect on your water and your water rates and your water infrastructure has to drink the water.
Yeah.
They are making those decisions for you.
Yeah. No, I mean, that's a great point too. Fantastic
That's right.
point. I mean, those folks are going to be corporate people sitting in office somewhere about the quality of your water. Every single one of us sitting at this will pay the, you have to remind citizens that we're paying the same bill, drinking the same water, and using the same
You
system.
live with the consequences of the decisions you make. It's the same thing if you see
a good
a
point,
company
Justin.
in New York City owning a landfill in Mississippi. They don't care what people put in that landfill.
That's right. All right, other questions? Justin and Alicia, anything else?
That's great.
Thank y'all.
Absolutely. Thanks
It's
for having us.
fantastic.
Yeah, very
Absolutely.
Appreciate it.
I would expect we'll be bothering you